We actually locked ourselves in just by shutting the door. But anyway, I'll call Scott later.
Are you kidding? Did I do that?
It's all right. It's all right. I'll call Scott afterwards so he can unlock
Release
the door.
us.
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's good to know next time.
Yeah. Alrighty, so good afternoon, everybody. Chris Dagger again for back-to-back podcasting today. So it's about 12:42, and we have a wonderful guest, which I'm privileged, whom I'm privileged to have, Cory Labrecque, Dr. Cory Labrecque, should I say?
Yeah. If you wish.
So you're probably, I think you're officially the first PhD that we're having on the show, and I think it's a wonderful opportunity, a wonderful privilege. I'm going to have Dr. Eric Buzetti later on.
Right.
I'm not sure if you know him. He's in political science.
Right.
Oh, you're familiar with?
Well, I know of him.
You know of him. Okay, yeah. So, I'm pretty excited for him as well. So, Cory, I think we've met at TITC 2022.
That's right. Not too long ago.
In the fall, not too long ago, and I remember sitting through your wonderful talk. It was about bioethics and was it medical assistance to dying or something?
We did bioethics generally in theology.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, folks, I'm going to give the floor to Cory Labrecque here.
Great.
Very honored to have you
Sure.
here. So, tell us more about like a bit about your bio, your studies, your theses, and all
of that good stuff.
All that good stuff.
So,
Cory.
Yeah. So thanks. No, it's great to be here. I love this department, and I love the colleagues here and students here. So it's a delight. It's always a delight to be here. So brief overview of what I did, right? So as a student, I studied at McGill, so not so far from here, and I was expecting to become a surgeon. I did my degree in anatomy and cell biology, and about halfway through that degree, my grandmother, with whom I was very, very close, moved quite quickly through Alzheimer's disease, and it was quite tragic. It was pretty traumatic, I would say, for us as a family. I was very, very close to her, very, very close to my mom. So my mom and my grandmother both lost their husbands within a few months, between them. So they both became widows at the same time. So I lost my dad and my grandfather around the same time when I was about 1. And as you know, death either divides a family or it binds a family.
Right.
And it did the latter for us. In many ways, it did the latter for us. We were already very close, but there you are. So when that grandmother developed Alzheimer's disease and we watched kind of the process, that was really tough. And eventually she was no longer able to stay at home. She was always fiercely independent, no longer able to stay home, and came to live with us. And that's when things really got tricky for me. And I started not caring about anything. I felt like everything was so trivial. Everything was just so mundane in the shadow of what I was seeing. Why go to class? Why to go? I shouldn't be saying this out loud for my students to hear, but why does any of this matter? And eventually, one of my advisors at McGill kind of pulled me aside and said, "What is happening? You're missing exams. You're not submitting stuff. This is quite the opposite of what we know from you. A student who had done well and so on and so forth in the past. And so what's going on?" And I was really hesitant to say anything, right? I didn't want to say, my grandmother is not well, so it's her fault. I didn't want any of that to come up. Right. But I did make mention of it, and I remember him saying very clearly, "Well, Cory, you realize she's no longer really your grandmother, so just kind of," and he didn't say it maliciously. I think he said it to reorient me, because I was starting to close doors, I think, by what was going on. And I took that to heart. And I started thinking about what that exactly meant. If she wasn't my grandmother then, so what's going on, here? And because of that, I started taking classes in ethics and theology. So my electives were being done there. And got called in once again by the same advisor who saw my transcript and was like, what is this, theology? Are you kidding? With his eyebrows, you could tell he wasn't frowning. Yeah, lots of frowning. He's like, "Are you kidding? This is not what we mean by optional courses. We mean more physiology and more biochemistry. So your heart's probably not here anymore." And I said, I think you're right. And he said, no, that's not what I meant. And I quickly finished that degree and started a new one in religious studies, because that's where I found, I think, the place where constructive conversations around these big questions were happening in serious and intelligent ways. And so I moved into that kind of area of academia. And then when it came time for graduate studies, I didn't want to relinquish my training in medicine, and I didn't want to relinquish my training in religion. So I bound them in the field of bioethics and took my master's in bioethics and then my PhD in the same area.
Mm-hmm.
I wrote my master's thesis on whether or not patients with Alzheimer's could still be considered persons, which is the whole grandmother thing, right?
Huge debate.
Yeah. And then went on to do my PhD in religion and ethics and looked at longevity and anti-aging medicine and cool stuff like that. Yeah.
Was that all at McGill?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting. Well, that's quite a extended adventure. Right?
Yeah, I was there, half my life by that time. Yeah.
And so it's an interesting way for you to showcase how you bounced from one very rigid hard science and then delve into humanities basically.
Right.
And I can 100% relate because I did my bachelor's degree over here at Concordia in biochemistry.
Right.
And I think you're around the dinner table. I was over at Loyola campus. Loyola campus. I was probably sharing that with you back then, and just to remind the folks, there are sometimes unseen bridges that people can build or fathom when it comes to hard sciences and humanities, and that really echoes the conference that we attended that you were basically emceeing for last week with Father Guy Consolmagno from the Vatican. Is he still in Montreal?
No, he left almost immediately. He's a delight. Brother Guy Consolmagno is a Jesuit, an astronomer. He did all of his degrees in planetary science, MIT, all that good stuff, very rich background, and then became head of the Vatican Observatory, right? And came to speak with us at McGill just a week ago. Yeah. And he was just great, right? That's one of my field of interest is in religion and medicine mm-hmm. and religion and science. So I'm largely interested in these bridges that you're talking about, Christopher, between what you think would not have, that many connections or explicit connections. And so when we invited him to come to Montreal, that's exactly what we wanted him to address. Tell us about the link between science and faith, right? Tell us about the links that, especially in Quebec, we are slow to make, right? For whatever reason that might be, for many reasons, in fact. But so that was really great. And then the first night he gave an opening talk on faith and science. And then the second evening we gathered a panel. So I was very privileged to sit on that panel with Basil Favis, who is a chemical engineer from l'École Polytechnique, and Dr. Victoria Caspi, who's a very well-known astrophysicist and professor at McGill. And we sat around the table with, Brother Guy and had a really great conversation about the relationship between science and faith.
Yeah, and you know what? Because I attended the March 26th conference, since it was on a Sunday. And I couldn't be there on Monday evening because I had a lecture here. Sure. These evening lectures because I'm doing my MA in theological studies here. So, but I did listen to it on YouTube because there was an audio version with just that one slide on in the background. I was listening to it at 1.5 speed, and it was interesting. What really gripped me was the fact that Basil Favis actually maintained his Christian faith despite or in parallel with his scientific studies. And that's something that, for me, because I grew up Christian, so I grew up Catholic my whole life. Now I'm more of an overarching Christian, as I like to say, because I go to evangelical services from time to time. And for me, it was never a challenge to maintain faith and study biochemistry and biology and those kinds of things. I'm wondering if, first of all, do you practice a particular religious faith, and did you find any struggles if you were a faithful person to maintain your faith and study science? Yeah,
that's a great question. I mean, so I'm probably from a pretty typical Quebec family where, and typical in the sense that religion is kept, I don't know if this is the way I should explain typical in Quebec, but where religion is kept kind of hidden and secret, right?
So post-1960s.
Right, very much so, Quiet Revolution, et cetera, et cetera. And in my own household, I come from kind of an interesting household where my dad was born in England and he was a Roman Catholic, and my mom, a Canadian of Scottish heritage, an Anglican. My mom was practicing, I hate that word, but my mom, was a churchgoer and so on and so forth until my father and my grandfather passed away, and that kind of rocked the boat, as they say, right? And that was that. In fact, I think the whole idea was when my mom was married to my father, they got married in the Catholic Church, and my mom said, yeah, we'll raise our children in the Catholic banner. And then my father died very suddenly. And I think it was the least of her worries that she had 2 Catholic children, who were 1 and 4. She was a young widow, at 30. I think that was the least of her concerns. But so I was raised in many ways in the Catholic public school system here in Quebec, and learned my tradition very, very quickly, and loved it. In fact, I'm in love with my tradition in many ways because of its intellectual foundations, and that really, really appealed to me. And I remember I had to be something like 10 years old or 11 years old. So my family we were not a church-going family, although I was, prepared for my sacraments and so on and so forth in the public school system, which is unheard of now.
Interesting.
And when I was about 10 or 11, just after I was confirmed, I remember thinking, and so I don't even know how this happens for a 10-year-old, but I remember thinking, wow, not so long ago, I stood up in front of a community and said, I believe in all of this, and I'm ready to engage in the life of the church. This is what you do in the sacrament of confirmation.
Right.
And then thought, wow, what a hypocrite I am. Here I am a few weeks later. No, it was only a few weeks, but it wasn't like, 10 years later. But a few weeks later, I thought, what a hypocrite. And I remember calling the church where I celebrated my sacraments, which is a stone's throw from my house, tiny bungalow-looking English Catholic parish in St. Hubert on the South Shore. Called up on a Saturday night. There was an answering machine, and it said the Sunday Mass is at this time. It was 10 a.m. And I said, okay. And the next morning, I put on my best jogging suit, and I put on my best loafers, the best
of the best.
Yeah, as you know, the
out of your wardrobe.
Highest fashion statement. And I went into my mom's room and I said, I'm going to Mass today. She could have easily said, what are you talking about? That we don't do that. And my mother considered herself a person of faith, of quiet faith. Right. Never did we speak the word, the name of God in the household. We didn't pray. That was not the kind of background I'm from. But to say to her, well, if you don't go to church, then you don't believe in God, kind of thing, which is a very bad link to make, that wouldn't have gone over well. Anyway, so I went into our room and I said, I'm going to Mass today. And instead of her saying, what? She said, go get my purse. And I remember saying, oh, how much does it cost, to go to church? And she's like, no, it's free. Right. But there'll be a basket for the needs of the community and for the needs of the church, and you'll want to put this into the basket. Okay. And that already brought lots of wisdom to the whole thing. I'm going to a place.
Yeah, I thought go get my purse at the church because she had forgotten it. She forgot.
Go get the stuff that I left there 20 years ago. In fact, it was quite it was quite interesting though that the first image I had as a child before I went on my own was this community gathers funds for people who for the needs of the community writ large. Yeah. And I thought there was something important about that. And so I went as a kid. Right. By myself, walked down the street. My mom was in the window watching the whole time. And when I got there, I remember thinking, oh, wow, I'm suddenly really nervous because I don't want anyone to ask me any questions. I'm not interested in getting into it. My mom's an Anglican. Right. She's not here. This Catholic, my father was Catholic, but he died when I was 1. I didn't want the pity. I didn't want any of that. I just wanted to sit and be.
Right.
And so in my wisdom, I ended up, moving in. I was a tiny guy until I was in my 20s.
In your joggers and all.
That's right. But in my best jogging pants. And I went in and I saw a seat in between what I thought were 2 families. And I thought, what a perfect place to sit, because if family A asks who I'm with, I'm going to say I'm with family B.
There you go.
And B, not understanding, of course, that these families have probably been going to this church for years and know full well that I'm not just a new kid. Right. Anyway, I didn't think of that. But that's how it happened. And then, fell in love with my tradition, loved the rituals. There was a really great, tiny youth group that it just happened that there was a tiny youth group there. And I want to say 4 of us became theologians. It's unheard of. It was just the right time, the right place. And we asked lots of questions and we're constantly engaged. And I never thought my tradition to be at all at odds with science. Mm-hmm. In fact, I was propelled, I think, into the arms of science because of wonder and awe about the world around me.
Yeah, I mean, likewise, when I was working in the lab during my undergrad years, where we worked with live breast cancer cells, how many people even say that? Breast cancer.
Yeah.
I mean, it never dawned on me to start rebuking my own faith because of the fact that I'm working in a scientific field, and I would go to Mass on Sundays, and I would basically go back to school during the week and learn whatever evolutionary theory was proposed, or chemical, or organic chemistry, inorganic chemistry, all the hard sciences, and I would just do both in parallel, and one wouldn't necessarily interfere or poke holes in the wheels of the other.
No, yeah, I think that's right. I mean, in many ways, when I was at Mass, I felt that in, I thought that was a perfect expression of celebrating the beauty of it all,
Right.
right? And then I would go to the labs and study, study anatomy with bodies in a lab, bodies that had been donated, and all that was just great. And I just recently at the panel actually with Brother Consolmagno, that I remember, I think it was there that I may have mentioned that one of the things that struck me as an undergrad was one of my first lectures, and it was in embryology. And the professor came out, well-known professor, and he came out in a beautiful amphitheater in the Strathcona building at McGill, and he came out and said, "Okay, listen, welcome to the study of embryology. That's what we're going to be doing in this course. But just to let you know, let me make this plain, that nobody understands how it is that a woman who becomes pregnant survives all of her vital organs being shunted up into the thoracic cavity, and all the pressure on those organs should probably kill her. I mean,
Right.
and it gets more stressful as the pregnancy kind of moves through."
Yeah.
And he says, "We don't really understand how that all happens. Well, we understand how it happens. We don't understand how she survives it.
Right.
But let's just carry on and study the molecular basis of adhesion cell, and just went on as if to kind of remind ourselves that the big questions still hang over us, right? And yet we're motivated to study the science behind it." Yeah, that was great. That was stirring to me.
And yeah, I'm glad that you brought up that particular point, because that's one scientific wonder among many when you look at how, I mean, if you're a believer like I am, like how God created, or the engineer behind the whole thing, created life to mechanistically work it the way it is. Obviously, like some, staunch atheists or
Sure.
evolutionary scientists would have their own set of arguments to argue that, there is not an engineer, or there has never been an engineer behind this whole process. I'm a firm believer in design theory, like in the fact that, God created the world, and it's not a coincidence that the Bible starts with Genesis, right? So yeah, just the fact that a woman may survive that pregnancy process, which us men will never have to experience one day, except that maybe I'm not allowed to say that anymore for
Who knows?
myriad
Who
reasons.
knows what's coming? Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I mean, in that particular talk was amazing, and I bumped into a fellow seminarian, Felix Lamontagne.
Great.
And Father Anthony Atanzi from the Newman Center, you probably know him.
Yeah, indeed.
And the thing is, like, I really regret not at least showing up during the day on Monday to, say hi to Father Guy, because apparently he visited the Newman Center.
Yeah, he was there with the students.
Missed out on that, and I wanted him on the podcast. I was looking up his Vatican information. Perhaps we'll have it over soon if he's available. And yeah, well, like, you were the MC, you were the opening voice, let's say, that day. Like, how did you get involved with that? Like,
yeah. So I mean, McGill. So as it was explained, McGill is. I'm an alumnus of McGill.
Right.
I have strong ties to McGill. I continue to love my mentors who are still at McGill. Many of my professors who I studied with are there, who I loved very, very much, and I have a deep gratitude in many ways to religious studies at McGill and to medicine at McGill, where I was, in both worlds, if I may say, where I was trained. And so I happen to sit on the board of the Newman Center. I'm also a scholar member of the Newman Institute for Catholic Studies.
Right.
And they have a small kind of subcommittee with Dr. Terry Hebert, who's in the Faculty of Medicine and Health Sciences as well, and I and Professor Dan Sear, Siri, who's at Religious Studies as well, got together and said, religion and science is huge, right? What can we do to kind of stir up conversations here in Montreal? And we thought of inviting Brother Guy Consolmagno, who's a well-known voice in the area of faith and science, and he very graciously accepted, and that's really how it all came to be. And since my study is in the area of religion, medicine, religion, and science, I was invited to give the opening. That was great.
It's a nice invitation.
Great honor.
Yeah, it must have been a great honor, and indeed, like, just to have, like, I've emceed different events, different youth conventions, that kind of thing. Like, it's nice to have that privilege to help everybody segue into a particular event, an event I really enjoyed, actually. One of the most amazing talks when it comes to marrying science and religion. And I'm glad that a priest from the Vatican who has scientific backing in his educational upbringing was able to do so. And so do you identify more as Catholic or Anglican or both? Or?
I'm an Anglican. Sorry, my mom was an Anglican. I'm a Catholic. and very much again in love with my tradition. And I never saw, my mom always made them, I think, the mistake of saying, Cory, I'm an Anglican, but I'm as close to Catholic as it gets. And I'm like,
Right.
I don't know. I don't think you should be saying that. I think you should be very happy being, part of the Church of England and being of that tradition, which is a beautiful tradition. And, there's so much dialogue between, the Anglican and the Catholic Church that I feel like we're ancient siblings in many ways. And I love and again, I love both traditions. I am Catholic, and I also have the great privilege of sitting on what's called the Pontifical Academy for Life, which is a group of academics from around the world that are invited to counsel the Vatican on ethical issues in medicine, biotechnology, and the environment. So I get to be in Rome, once or twice a year.
That's great.
With this group of 100 plus academics from the four corners, talking about huge ethical issues, and you name it, right? And it's always very avant-garde. A lot of people think, oh, when you go to the Vatican, what are you talking about, like sundials and stuff? And I'm like, no. This year we're talking about robotic accompaniment of seniors, or tissue engineering, or transhumanism and
Right.
artificial intelligence. And they're like, oh, that's pretty contemporary stuff. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's a nice opportunity to, stretch arms into these different topics, because there are a lot of science-related topics that are extremely important, but nonetheless quite inflammatory. Like, you can think about the abortion issue, the different, the church's stance on different forms of sexuality,
Sure.
LGBTQ type of issues, which, thankfully in the theology department, we don't really delve into that, because we're focused more on theological questions. Like, this is the Lonergan room, and we have, we really herald Bernard Lonergan as a pillar, and a toolbox,
Sure.
literally a toolbox,
Yeah.
to provide these different methods in theology, when it comes to doctrine, dogma, history, communications, functional specialties, that kind of thing. So when you leaped from science into religious studies, did you feel a challenge in transitioning into humanities? Did you feel like you were penetrating a different world?
Yeah.
How was the transition?
Yeah, no, I think it really was because, after that supervisor said your grandmother's no longer really your grandmother, after that, when I was talking to him and talking about Alzheimer's disease, and again, I don't think he was being malicious,
Right.
but it made me stop and think, then, what does this all mean exactly? What is the illness experience? And what does my faith have to do with any of this? And how can my faith help me think about suffering, mortality,
Right.
disease, and so on and so forth? And so I think the transition to the humanities was a very natural one. In fact, I was getting I was doing all kinds of really interesting science work in my bachelor's, even in terms of the science of aging and the diseases of aging and so on and so forth. Alzheimer's disease, and at the time we talked about neurodegenerative diseases. Now we don't speak of them in that way anymore. But there's that language to me that, well, there's that kind of discussion that's incredibly important. But I was missing the existential, the natural conversations around, is there value to suffering, and tell me about human limitations, and what does all this stuff mean in the grand scheme of things? And those types of questions were being, I think, talked about in a very constructive way in theology and in religious studies. Whereas I think a lot of people might think of these fields as being very, if I may, kumbaya, right? Oh, you're in religious studies, you're in theology, you hold hands, I guess you guys pray and sing about Jesus all the time, and you're like, that's fun, but let me tell you what we actually do, right? And in fact, what I loved about my field is that, and religious studies and theology at McGill, and I'm sure, here at Concordia, there's openness to this kind of dialogue too, is that there's this love for interdisciplinarity. And, the idea is that you want to find yourself in a classroom with chemists and theologians and social scientists and, everyone else who can have a voice in these deep and intricate conversations about sexuality, about gender, about name the ethical issue across the board in medicine, whether it be medical aid in dying or assisted nutrition and hydration and artificial intelligence. There's so much going on that I think it is the responsibility of people in religious studies and theology to be having these conversations and to show in many ways that the resources of these fields are still incredibly relevant to pressing contemporary issues, right? So I think, when people say, oh, what does theology have to do with, the language on gender right now, or what does theology have to do with artificial intelligence? Are you kidding? Yeah. And right away I say a lot, in fact, right, a lot, and it's an important voice at the table to stir conversation.
Absolutely, yeah. And with artificial intelligence and ChatGPT and the development of these are kind of forces that we're reckoning with that are far stronger and far more, that have a magnitude that exceeds our wildest expectations.
Yeah.
And I'm glad that you recognize, and that a lot of people do more and more, that recognize more and more that these different fields like hard sciences and humanities have linkages. And I think C.S. Lewis once said something along the lines of if man only if man only follows reason, it cultivates not a better human being but a greater demon, or something along the lines of, like, you need faith and reason matched together. It's just who is Anglican, actually, and very well respected by the Catholic Church. So yeah, it's interesting that and you can look at the Nazis. Back in Nazi Germany, they were highly intelligent people, but their faith or their adherence to a higher order or a higher raison d'etre, that wasn't necessarily there. They were super intelligent. Some of the greatest scientists were in Nazi Germany, but they didn't have a moral compass to not do what they're doing. And I'm reading a book right now by Viktor Frankl, Map Search for Meaning.
Yeah, great text. I love
to understand like what was going on during the Holocaust and that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, and it does bring up the whole question that we see very often in my field about valueless science, or is it still science if there's no virtue there, right? One of the Holocaust is a very good example of, can we even call any of those experiments, and I cringe to use the word experiments in the context, because I think it was not science, right? We're talking about monstrosity across the board. And the question is a good one, right? In the shadow of it all, about, so what is science exactly then?
Right.
If it's the pursuit of a certain kind of knowledge, well, what if that pursuit is done demonically, in a as inhumane way as you can? Is it still science? Right. Well, some people will say, well, you're still collecting data. Yeah, but are you doing it in a way that is, first of all, empirical, objective, et cetera, because all of that is lacking when you look at this particular context, right, of the Shah. All of those questions are really important. What I love about Frankl, that's such a great book. I'm glad you're reading his Man's Search for Meaning. I read it when I was in college, in CEGEP here in Quebec, and missed my bus like 4 times because I just was on the bench reading through it.
It is captivating.
It's captivating. It's a very quick read. The first 100 pages or so is about his experience in the concentration camp, and largely talks about what does meaning how can you even talk about meaning making when you're in the dark, right? Where it's just death, where it's torture, where it's the worst of humanhood, right? And so how can you think about all of that? And he deals with that very, very delicately and very, very intelligently, in fact. So I have a deep appreciation for that. But I think in many ways he like my religious tradition, like Christianity and Judaism at large, teach this whole idea that humans have this inherent dignity that's rooted in this idea that we're made in the image and likeness of God. And that becomes really important as a foundational piece when we're thinking about science. So when I think about gender and sex, when I think about abortion and euthanasia or medical aid in dying, when I think about any issue that is kind of thrown in my direction in terms of ethics, the first thing I lay down is the intrinsic dignity of humanhood that comes from my faith tradition, that comes from my theology. And I think that's so important, right, when we're thinking about the relationship between faith and science, and what faith brings to the table, right, when we're talking about ethics and science in medicine, for instance.
And I think like inviting you to the podcast now is very timely, because I'm taking Theo 603, which is a method in theology course with Dr. Jameson.
Yeah.
Dr. Jameson is heavily involved with bioethics.
Yeah.
And she's on the National Board of Catholic Bioethicists Committee, and she's heavily involved with that. She's also super knowledgeable about indigenous studies, like the whole indigenous spirituality topic. I'm wondering if you are you specialized or not special, or have you ever taken courses on indigenous spirituality as well?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a diverse, right, vision. And when we're talking about indigenous spiritualities, certainly in the plural, I think of Dr. Jameson and her wisdom, right, which is, I think, a deep resource for this department, to be sure, and for so many of us, in fact.
And the correlation with ethics as well.
Yeah, which makes sense that you would be talking with these at the crossroads. And yeah, I mean, I've taken a number of courses. What I love, I used to teach for about 10 years. I've been teaching a course called, oh gosh, it's probably more like 20 years, but anyway, a course called Religious Ethics in the Environment, where we explore different religious different religious visions about the environment. What do they think about creation? Are we talking about a God here? What is is there ecological spirituality related to these traditions? And we always spend time, looking at the Mysticini Cree as one example of very many indigenous spiritualities, in terms of the relationship between humans and nature, human-animal nature relationships, human-nature-animal creator relationships, and so on and so forth. And it just brings a whole other vision to the discussion that I think students appreciate and often forget, is very much part of our Canadian heritage, even though we have not respected it as such for centuries, right? And I think Dr. Jamieson's work is what brings that to the table, to say, let me remind you of the wisdom of these traditions, right, that are often squelched or hidden or persecuted in many ways, right? And I think that becomes a very important conversation for us in contemporary theology too.
And on my end, like, I have this mea culpa feeling where I feel guilty to have not known enough about this super important part, in my own history as a Canadian, just to understand the hardships that these people have gone through, which is, nevertheless, permanently tattooed on Canadian history because of the fact that, they are, as a multitude of nations, Indigenous people are a foundational part of our culture.
Yeah, indeed. And I think that's why, when I think about my own faith tradition and I think about theological resources that I kind of engage when I'm thinking about ethical issues in large in medicine, biotech, and the environment, again, I always come back to this notion of the intrinsic dignity of the human, but also, especially for me in bioethics, one thing that I always really start with is it is the experience of suffering, right, of the people I come across. And so in bioethics, for instance, we're constantly talking about patients, right? And as you can imagine, the ethics cases that I study with my students are never pleasant. Mm-hmm. They're always hard, very difficult cases, and there's a lot of suffering involved. And I think, when I think about the indigenous experiences, if I may, in Canada throughout history, if I think about trans people and their experiences in Canada in the history of our country, if I think about patients who are, with Alzheimer's disease and their experiences and so on and so forth in the healthcare system in Canada, I think it's always incredibly important to start with this twofold idea that at once all humans are sealed with the image of God, in the image of God, and therefore have an intrinsic dignity, and two, we're talking about suffering here. And so before we even begin to start evaluating lives, which people love to do, and I think that's always problematic, let's just remind ourselves that we are co-woundable, right? That we are in a community where people are wounded and being wounded, and still have this intact dignity even though it's being trampled on. So let's start with that, and now let's have our ethics discussions, right? With that kind of underneath, being the foundation of it all. Yeah. I think that's important, right? So just recently, I know I want to keep you with the.
Oh, go ahead.
Just recently, I was abroad giving a talk on bioethics, Catholic bioethics, and I was approached by a leader in the Catholic tradition who said, "Tell me more about how should we start thinking about trans identity, right? Which is not my area. This is not my area of expertise, to be sure." And I said, "Listen, this is not my area. I'm a medical ethicist and so on and so forth. But where we need to start is before you start making sweeping, critiques about things about people and about experiences that you do not know, make sure that you begin with this idea of dignity, which is entrenched in my tradition. In the Christian and Jewish traditions, these are, capital P
Empathy.
principles. It's exactly what, binds us. I'm like, so you start there and start with understanding, of course, that trans people and other people around, who we're talking about in terms of ethics and so on and so forth, are wondering, are mulling over their self-value in a world that constantly casts them into the margins, might be thinking about taking their lives because the suffering is too much, is overwhelming. And like, let's remind ourselves that we are speaking about real life humans with real life suffering and real life experiences. So before we go ahead and say X, Y, and Z in terms of an ethical judgment, remind yourself of the solidarity that's kind of behind all of this.
I'm really glad that you mentioned one of the letters, the T letter in the LGBTQ amalgamation of people, the trans people. And I'm wondering what your opinion is about fellow Christians that may not have the same point of view. Like, let's say folks from, I don't know if you're familiar with the Daily Wire. I listen to their content on a regular basis, and like some of these folks come with a good heart from a good place, but they have a different angle and a diametrically opposed angle compared to what you're saying. So I'm wondering what your opinion is on that particular thing, on their stance.
Yeah, well, so I'm an ethicist, right? So, which means that I'm constantly at the crossroads of different opinions, right? And it's just like, I think in many ways it mirrors what I do as a professor in my classroom. So never am I, my mandate as a professor is not to make sure that all of my students are on board with are match my convictions. Otherwise they fail or something like that. Right? It doesn't work like that. No, of course not. And in many ways, my mandate as a professor is to cultivate constructive analysis and constructive thinking around these delicate issues, and making sure that my students, their eyes are very wide open, right, to what we are dealing with and what we are looking at, and making sure again that we start with the platform of dignity, and we start with the platform of what I call shared woundability, right? That is that binds all humans. And so for me, I always start there. And so I expect there to be tension. I always expect there to be conflict of opinion. Of course, this is why there's a whole field of ethics, right? It's because we don't agree on many of these on many of these issues. But I think my role, certainly as an academic, is to put as much on the table, as much relevant stuff, if I may, on the table, and especially that stuff, if I may, that's often just neglected. I want to make sure that if we're going to have a conversation about, you name the issue, so whether it be gender, sex, medical aid in dying, et cetera, whatever the issue might be, we want to make sure that as theological ethicists, for instance, we bring to the table those ingredients, in the conversation, or those elements of the conversation that are often overlooked, that actually are incredibly pertinent or relevant, right? So that dignity stuff and that empathy stuff, all that information that I think is fundamental. But in ethics conversations, we completely bypass them and go straight to the kind of judgment or conclusion.
Interesting.
Yeah.
But would that be an imprudent approach to jump to conclusion?
Yeah, I think so. I think Jonathan Haidt and other great psychologists have made these claims, right? That very often what we see, certainly and I would say certainly in the ethics context, is that we are more often than not, perhaps, very quick to announce what our judgments might be on whatever the issue whatever the issue of the day is.
Yeah.
But then when somebody asks for justification or for what the rationality might be, we we hesitate because we didn't quite think about putting that constructive thinking before the judgment. So the conclusion comes out very, very quickly. I'm anti or I'm pro or whatever the very black and white kind of distinctions are. I'm either for or against these things, and there you have it. And then when you say, okay, that's fine, but why? There's some hesitation there, and then you say, but what about this? Have you considered A, B, and C? And there's often hesitation around it, and I think it's because maybe we don't have the fora anymore, right, for people to have these kinds of conversations in a constructive, safe, and kind of deeply intellectual environments. And I think that's our role.
Right. No, yeah, for sure. And I think in different situations, different places have become landmines or just
Yeah.
fields of eggshells where people are that they feel like they're walking on eggshells when they try to talk about these different issues. Like
Yeah.
especially, do you believe that universities have become hostile environments, especially with what happened at Evergreen a couple of years ago
Sure.
with a particular professor who got kicked out?
Yeah, and we see that, right, more and more, and sometimes it comes at the these issues are sometimes spoken alongside academic freedom and other really important, I think, issues that we're seeing in the contemporary university.
Right.
That's I think we should expect that, and I think we should continue to strive to make the university a home for constructive conversation. I think that's our goal, right? In many ways, my students are I like to think that that's exactly my role, is to make sure that my students are thinking constructively, that they always hear me say this: make sure that when you're about to write whatever your judgment is or whatever the conclusion might be for this particular case that we're studying, that you've thought about all sides. I was going to say all sides of the coin when a coin has two, but many sides of the
dice.
Yeah, that's right, of the dice or whatever it might be of this particular conversation,
Yeah.
especially those that you don't agree with. I don't want you leaving those out of the conversations because you can't handle them. That's deeply, that's not only inappropriate, it's irresponsible as an academic, right? To say, I don't agree with that at all, but I don't really know how to answer it, so I'll just not include that in my paper, or I'll kind of leave that out strategically. No, in fact, you want to be hearing different voices from different disciplines who fuel the conversations in a way that I can think more largely about these complex things. People forget, I think, that when we talk about spirituality and sexuality and healthcare and suffering, these are complex things.
Right.
But what do? We often reduce them and simplify them to very black and white kinds of conversations where you're like, I don't think this is at all reflective of what humans are experiencing on the ground.
Yeah, for sure. And those topics oftentimes are perpetrators for polarization. I don't like to use perpetrator because they're important topics, but they often cause polarization, and especially today, I feel like we're more divided than ever when we compare with people that were either right leaning or left leaning.
Yeah.
Now they're either on the far left or the far right, and a lot of people that were liberals in the past are more they stick to their liberal standpoint, but they're more center left now because of how other people were suckered into far left. And same thing on the right side of the spectrum, where people were like, personally, I'm open to admitting that I'm a center person politically and even religiously and economically.
Sure.
Maybe I tilt a little bit more to the right, to be perfectly honest, but I'm definitely not mostly on the right. I'm definitely not mostly far left or anything. So yeah, I mean, I'm glad that the theology department here is, and I really, really hate to use this word, a safe space to discuss the different issues, because a lot of people are tackling things intellectually and as they should. Yeah. Right. Yeah. So, and I think you're kind of in that same boat where you're looking at things intellectually without necessarily pouring in too much emotion, but without subtracting passion from the equation as well. Was there any situation where you really felt uncomfortable and you felt like, okay, I, either as a professor or as a visiting academic, or a particular scenario where you felt, okay, this shit might hit the fan here, or something? No,
so thankfully, I guess, I've never been. I can't remember ever really being in a situation where I thought, do I crawl under the table now, or where's the nearest emergency exit? I've never been, and I think it's because there's as I look to the right. But I think it's because I don't think of my role as a professor to be, let me walk in and tell you what my truth is. Right. And and this is just what it is, right? In many ways, I come in and say, what wisdom do you have to bring to this conversation? Absolutely. Right. And I think I forget, I think sometimes we forget as professors too, that students, come with a whole gamut of experiences themselves, right? I learned that very, very quickly when I had a student come to my door when I was at Emory University. I was a professor at Emory for 5 really wonderful years. And I had a student knock on my door and said, I really want to take your Catholic, was I teaching Abrahamic religions and bioethics, or Catholic bioethics? And she said, I really want to take this class. And I said to the student, and she said, but I'm not sure if I could do it or not. I'm like, what are you talking about? You've taken like 5 of my classes already. You're always straight A student. In fact, you shouldn't take any more because there's much greater wisdom out there than me. So go and, go away. Not go away, but yeah, that's right. So, and she said, no, it has nothing to do with any of that. It's just that, last year I lost my dad, and this year my mom was diagnosed with terminal cancer. And so I'm not sure I'll be able to sit in a class if we're talking about suffering or death or, and how to grapple with these. And I think we forget that, yep. So our students have lots of insight based on experiences that we don't necessarily think they have because they are cloaked by youth, right? And so we think, oh, you're so far from this, so cute, and there's an infantilization that happens there. I certainly don't make the generalization that that's the case for all professors, to be sure, but I'm speaking for myself, where I'm like, oh, I was hit by that, where I was like, oh God, that's right, things. And so when I'm speaking about abortion, for instance, or when I'm speaking about medical aid in dying, right, I don't take it for granted, right, that I have students in my assembly, in my classroom who have been sexually violated, or who have been at the bedside of a parent or a sibling or a child, right, who they watched die. Yeah. I know that colors everything. And so I think, when I teach or when I present, I come with that understanding that my audience, or the audience rather, is attentive and often in that room because of those experiences. Not always, but because they've had those experiences and they want to come and hear others reflect constructively about it. And so my role is never to come in and be sensational or let me now say things that are going to rock. That's never. I don't look to polarize. I look to discuss. I look to lay things out and say, this is where we are. How can we take all of these pieces of the conversation and start working with them? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Interesting. Yeah. I'm glad that you're not taking a position where you're willing to lay down the law for people to basically take the course according to one angle or one perspective, which would totally counteract the whole purpose of being a professor, right? And that might wound a lot of people in the classroom because I've had professors that were a little bit more authoritative in their stance, which is never a good experience, to be honest.
I mean, I don't remember, I'm trying to think if I've had some, professors who have shut down conversations, but I think they did that because it wasn't their expertise and they didn't want to open, the forum for things because they were afraid that they wouldn't be able to guide the conversation appropriately. Mm-hmm. I think there's some responsibility to behind that, which I think we have to be careful with, writ large. But for the most part, I had a really good run as an undergrad and a grad student who had a lot of good role models. I think, certainly where I was trained in both religion, theology, and medicine, that had a lot of good people who were very genuinely and very sincerely open to good, solid, intelligent dialogue and keeping that door open, right, for it to kind of continue and hearing my insight and so on and so forth. So I always felt like a valuable kind of contributor to that, even if from undergrad all the way through. But yeah, I don't, and what's interesting too is as a professor, I've never been asked by a student, not once, in fact, and maybe now that I'm saying it, I'll be asked tomorrow, but not once have I ever been asked by a student, well, what do you think about this issue? Right. What is your opinion on this here? Yeah. Very, very rarely, I can't even remember that ever happening. Again, because I think students realize that that's not what we're doing here. Right. Right. And in fact, if you want to know, take a look at what I've written on certain issues and so on and so forth. That's another thing you might find. And even my writing is not usually, let me tell you why this is black. Let me show you how this is black and white, and I'm on this particular side. Right. Very often it's just, again, to stir and to stimulate conversation beyond what I'm seeing in the general public. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, and afterwards, if students have their own ideas, then they can use those to build their own opinion or perspective about a topic, and that's, they're free to do so. Yeah. Thankfully, we live in Canada, free society, where you're not going to get...
and I mean... Yeah. And I think that's the beauty, too, of theology and religious studies, is that very often a student can do that kind of thing in term papers, if I may, if there's a certain liberty, from the professor to write in an area. But in my courses, in my bioethics environment courses and so on and so forth, I tell students, listen, if I'm giving you the liberty to choose a topic in this particular field, we'll do that according to what's interesting to you or your experiences or something that you've seen, not so much so that you can write an opinion piece. That's not what I'm asking for here. But I want you to think now, I always use that word, but constructively and critically, this is your time to do this in an intellectual framework, right? By thinking about it now, not just in terms of, what you've seen and so on and so forth. But now let's use literature, and yet let's use arguments that you're finding across the grounds. Let's think about what people are saying about the particular issue that you're bringing into the term paper, and both for and against, and every other, every kind of position in between, so that when you come to a conclusion about this issue, it's actually quite well informed, and it's not just an off the cuff. This is what I saw. This is what this is what I experienced, and therefore this is my conclusion. Well, do what you saw, what you experienced, and what you've engaged in. Integrate all of that, right, with the literature and with the resources of theology and religious studies. And now tell me, right, how informed your conclusions are. Not to change them, right, but to enrich them in many ways. Absolutely. They may change, of course, but yeah.
I mean, teaching is definitely an experience, and being a professor. You've been a professor for how long now?
So I think I started teaching in my 20s. I was a course lecturer when I was a graduate. Graduate student.
You did mention that, I think, on the.
Did I? Oh yeah. That's right. I loved that. I had to be in my 20s then, so it's going on like 20 years that I've been teaching at the university.
Yeah, it's quite a while. Like I do tutoring on the side. So I do TAing here at Concordia, but also just to make more pocket money, I do tutoring like here and there, and wonderful. I tutor in math, science, French, English, and a little bit of chemistry as well. So I'm kind of all over the place with students, and thus far I've racked up just over 300 hours.
Is that crazy?
And, when you think about it, it's 300 hours of teaching. Right. How many hours per semester does a college professor teach?
Yeah.
So, and that's me being like, freelance, not really freelance because I work as an independent contractor with another company. Sure. But I go around and I teach these different kids, like in St. Jerome, Blainville, Terrebonne, Montreal, Laval. I live in Laval, so it's easier for me to commute. And right now, and my supervisor really commended me for that, because Dr. Gagne said that it's a good way to exercise that pedagogy. And on top of that, I'm doing the C-Teach graduate diploma here at Concordia, and I just purchased an online course with Harvard Block Center.
Fine.
I'm not sure if you found that one. It's pretty expensive though, because I used the International Women's Day rebate to get the pricing down from $3,200 down to $2,600. I thought, that's a nice $2,600 investment. Yeah. If they're going to see that Harvard prestige badge on the CV, but at the same time, it's a good way to learn, the how to write a teaching philosophy statement, that kind of thing. And since you have like two decades of experience, I was wondering, tell us more about that adventure. Like, how did you break into the profession, and how have you evolved ever since as a academic professional?
So I think things have. Yeah, this is interesting, because I'm not a person of ambition, and so it's not like I'm a big go-getter. I remember when I was interviewed at
unlike me, like I'm a huge go-getter.
Oh, that's great. And I admire that. I've never been that kind, and so I've been blessed in many ways that things have kind of come to my door, and I'm like, oh, this is wonderful. It's thank God. These things have really worked for me, and I'm very grateful for it. But I was never one who was kind of like I wouldn't call myself ambitious. I remember too being interviewed once, and somebody said, the interviewer said, "Where do you want to see your name in lights?" And I'm like, "Oh, I don't. Yeah. I just want to teach. I just want to have students. I want to be with my students and accompany my students. That's where I want to be." And they're like, "That's not quite the answer we were looking for."
It's almost like asking the question, like, how can I flatter your ego?
Yeah, perhaps. How can I make you feel? Yeah, I mean, but I think as a professor would have, as a course lecturer, for instance, I started when I was again a graduate student. I had a stellar mentor who is just an incredibly important specialist in religion and ecology, Lisa Sedaris, who was at McGill for a while, and I was very grateful that she was at McGill.
I think she still is at McGill.
No, she had moved on to Indiana and is now in California, and is doing wonderful stuff. She works a lot on a lot of her work touches on Rachel Carson, the work of Rachel Carson, and the idea of wonder and awe, which is a fantastic kind of idea to be exploring when you're a specialist in religion and ecology, right? And so she does lots of great work there. But it was really her, it was really Professor Sedaris who said, here are these courses that we're teaching. You've been a TA for me for a while. Would you like to assume responsibility for this particular course for whatever reason it was? And I thought, what is happening? And I remember
it's a big break.
It was and at first I didn't even think about it as a break. I thought it more of as it makes me so happy to be with students and to be discussing these big things, that it was kind of like it's like I had just won something in many ways. I was not at all thinking, I wasn't like, rubbing my hands together thinking, yeah, this is a good CV. And quite the opposite. It was oh my gosh, I love doing this. And now you want me to like not be behind the scenes, but like really with the students in the midst of it. That to me was just I just won something. And I still remember, I think I was teaching out at McGill's St. Anne de Bellevue campus, and I was teaching maybe 30, 40 students. It was religious ethics in the environment. That's what I was teaching. And I went out there, and I remember being at the front of the classroom where I can't remember what the topic was, but it was very early. It was my first course, and feeling as I was talking, I don't know how I managed to do both, but as I was talking, thinking, this is amazing. I was thinking of that in my head, and I had no idea what I was talking about, but it was just it was very clear to me that this was vocation and not just a career, right? That I was called to be in this space. It just made me very, very happy. And I think because it made me so happy, I just kept on teaching, right? Because it's smart. That's what I do.
What I like to say often is, teaching is in accord with Ephesians 4:11, right? Where I think Paul or whomever wrote the letter mentions five different vocations,
not just
professions.
One of them.
You have the evangelists, the pastors, the I can't
but
one of them is teachers. And when I read the New Testament, I read the New Testament when I had COVID, which kind of drew me to theology. It's interesting how the guy upstairs actually works things out, because I started in fall of 2021, so about a year before that I got COVID, and I did not sleep for 2 weeks apparently. So my dad was encouraging me, because my parents are religious, so they encouraged me to read the Bible to cope through COVID.
Sure.
And I did take a few. I took benzodiazepines, and that made me hallucinate, which is a topic for another day. I guess, because I have somebody who's on April 24th, I'm going to have a psychologist who talks about drugs a lot, because drugs is super popular, and I don't take drugs. I'm straight edge, but yeah, like just reading through that, like I read the whole New Testament. I was like, okay, Ephesians 4:11, outlining of these five different roles that you get to play, and I always knew that I had a knack for teaching, coaching, public speaking, that kind of thing. But that's in the Bible.
Yeah. Like as a vocation, as a call. Yeah, and I largely think of it that way. And I think in many ways too, I'm grateful for the fact that the professors that I've had in my time have been of that kind too, of that mind, right? Of teaching less as career and more as vocation, right? People who are really passionate about being in the classroom and being with their students and seeing their students soar in many ways. And I think, and it's all of that, the getting for it. I just love the idea of like, let's this is what you think of, this is what you think about A, right? This particular topic. Now let's talk about all the other stuff, right? That goes that should be going with it that we don't think about. And our eyes light up, and the students are so engaged. And me too, and the stuff that I learn from students who say, yeah, but who will bring their own experiences to it and change up the conversation and redirect us in many ways. And it's such a rich, no wonder it's considered to be a from on high. There's something just so blessed about the whole thing.
And there's a massive debate regarding childhood educators, like K through 12, and even high school educators, whether or not they should get paid more for what they actually provide, because pre-inflation they were getting paid, I don't know, like $35K a year, which is a basic salary. And I've had this conversation with a lot of friends where it's interesting to see how a high school teacher or a stage-up teacher can definitely have a huge impact on a person's psyche, because they might drift someone, a tender age human being, somebody under the age of 20, into a totally different direction.
Absolutely.
Just by influencing them
in a positive
or negative way.
And it's so hard to say, like, I'm really, in terms of salary and how to match the salary with what everyone does such a, it's so important what they do that I don't know what it means to match. Like, how can you put a price on that? I don't know, right? And
that's one parameter, right?
Right. And my wife is a kindergarten teacher, so I'm very familiar with these kinds of discussions. And very often, if you were to ask her, for instance, what her mandate is as a kindergarten teacher, like, what is your goal? She'll tell you outright, my goal is to have the kids at 4 or 5 years old fall in love with learning. That's what I'm going to do from September to June. I'm going to convince is not the right word, because I don't want to think of it as imposition, but I'm going to show these kids how much fun it is and how they're going to love learning, and that this is a space where they're going to grow and feel that they are valued and nurtured regardless of what's happening in the home and regardless of what's happening in the community. And that sets the stage for just as you said, for a lifelong commitment to feeling valued, hopefully, to feeling like their opinions count with what they're learning about, to being eyes wide open about, whatever the subject's going to be for the day. I think in many ways that's what we're cultivating. And so elementary and high school teachers, stage-up teachers, not to say at all, I wouldn't ever say that they were like, they're the ones that get the kids ready for me. Like I had never thought about that way. It is very much, we're all, I feel like we're all in the same family, right? We're all in the same family,
right,
working at different levels, needing different skills in many ways, but all committed to this idea of loving to learn and cultivating in the student, again, a sense of value in what, not just in how they're learning and what they're learning, but what they're bringing to the learning themselves, right? I think we're all on that page.
Absolutely. And I was just wondering, like, are you a fan of bonding with your students, like keeping long-term relationships with your? Because a lot of professors don't do that.
Yeah.
Others really enjoy doing that. So.
Yeah. I mean, I'm always delighted when a student reaches out, right, 10 years later, saying, "You won't remember." It's always this, It starts, "You won't remember me, but because I was one in the 300 in the crowd, that you won't remember me, but I remember this particular course or this thing that you said has stayed with me, and now I'm an environmental something or other." And you're like, "What? Because you took a class, how awesome is that?" But I think there's so much gratitude, I think, on my side when I see that kind of gratitude from students too. That is just, I mean, I have a file where I keep these emails, right? Just because I go back to them and I beam at them, right? Yeah. But it's always just, I mean, I keep the lines open, to be sure. Students know very well that after, and I always say this, and I don't know if I should actually at the end of courses, but I always tell students this: listen, the conversation doesn't end here, right? We continue going. There's more to talk about, and it happens, right, that students will seek me out and come to my office and say, "So how'd you 3 years ago? Can we talk about whatever it might be?" And I'm in my office, and that's what we're chatting about, right? And I think that's so important.
Yeah, I mean, especially if they make that extra mileage to make it to your office.
Yeah, of course. I mean, if they're knocking on my door, it's a delight. It makes me incredibly happy. Unfortunately, sometimes, especially as an ethicist, they're knocking on my door or writing me an email because there's something not so pleasant has happened, right? So they've been diagnosed with something, or a parent is really ill, or sometimes that's why they'll come asking questions, saying, "What do I do?" And I very often have to say, "Well, I'm not a therapist, I'm not a physician, but I am 100% here to listen, right, and chat with you and they know who I am already, right? So that to me, and I always, here's some resources. These are the people that can actually, but if what you're looking for is somebody who will listen, oh yeah, my door is wide open. Yeah.
Yeah. Oftentimes, like, folks are more in need of a shoulder to cry on, or not necessarily an ear to listen to their thoughts, more than an actual guidance counselor.
Yeah, yeah. And students will say that, and even though I think it's important for professors to make very plain to students, if you are, and to recognize a certain need, right, that the need of the particular student who's in my office right now is way beyond my expertise and way beyond my skills, and to make sure that you put the student on route to make sure that they get those particular services, right, that are always existent at the university, or hopefully always exist at the university. Yeah. That if the student has come to you saying, no, I already have those services at my fingertips, and it's all working really well.
Right.
I just need to chat with you about this as a human, right, kind of thing. Not even as a friend, not as a parent, but as a person who I know has studied some of the stuff or whatever it might be, or because I've heard you talk about whatever it might be, and I just want somebody who's just going to talk to me without having, links to me as parent or physician or therapist or whatever that might be. And yeah, it's always a delight to speak to students there. It's often heartbreaking too, because very often the subject is not a happy one.
Right.
Sometimes they are, thank God, but sometimes they're not. And I think, as a professor, I understand that. Yeah, I understand that. And I feel like that's part of my vocation too.
And I mean, as a professor, sometimes there's oftentimes, or most of the time, your schedule is super flooded and you're a busy guy, right? So did it ever happen that you might feel urged to turn somebody away, or like, are you always receptive, or how do you make time?
Yeah, I think professors struggle with this in many times. I mean, does it happen that a student writes an email or comes to our office and we're like, oh gosh, I'm teaching in 22 seconds, right? Yeah, of course, that happens. I'm trying to think of my own history. I don't remember ever a time where I needed to say, no, I'm sorry, I don't have time for you. What often happens on my side is that I'll get a student who will say something in an email, right? Who will say something like, Professor, can you just what is this whole God thing? Question mark. Love, Johnny. And you're like, okay, Johnny, so I'm not going to respond to you in an email because this is going to be a really long email, but how about we meet? I'm the one that always says we need to meet.
Yeah.
We need to chat. And I certainly do what I can to make time for my students, and professors know this, that when we do that, often it means that our writing responsibilities and our correcting, all the stuff that we need to get done is kind of pushed aside. And yeah, of course it is. That's what it is. Yeah, that's what it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Let's talk about bioethics.
Sure.
I mean, bioethics is something that is interesting me more and more, and I have fellow classmates that are writing their master's thesis about it.
Yeah.
Especially MAID, medical assistance in dying. Like, if you were to pick out among the many topics that you may have encountered in your journey, like the top three, like bioethics topics, what would they be? And let's just delve into a little bit of depth into those.
Yeah, that's a hard one. So I think and this comes out of the wisdom of some of the members on that. Remember, I told you I'm a member of the Pontifical Academy for Life, right? That helps the Vatican think about some of these big issues. And so they've already picked the ones that they think, artificial intelligence is a big one right now in healthcare, and about what it's doing to the patient-physician relationship and so on and so forth. That's huge. Robotics in, right now I'm thinking a lot about, with another committee, I belong to I'm a vice president of the Comité National d'Éthique sur le Vieillissement, so the National Committee on Ethics and Aging here in the province of Quebec. And we think about giant ethical issues in aging. And one of them is technologies and aging, right? And the whole idea of having a robot, and I put this word in quotation marks, a robot, quote unquote, companion, right, to counter isolation, right, in population of aged persons and so on and so forth. So these are huge issues. But what I love about being on the Pontifical Academy is that very often I have colleagues from across the ocean or in the global south, for instance, who will lean to me while we're talking about heady issues like artificial intelligence and robotics and transhumanism, and will lean over and say, is this not just a little elitist? I mean, in my country, we're still trying to figure out how to get past a life expectancy of 40, for instance, or something, Right. And I think that's always incredibly grounding, and it helps me, again, remind myself where I am and where I'm situated. So I think that's really important when we're thinking about bioethics writ large. But just to remind you that, wherever we are in the world, understand that the bioethics issues are very different, and not just, from one country to the next. In Canada, you don't have to drive very far to get people to say, well, here our concerns are pesticide use in agriculture, for instance, or over here it's pediatric medical aid in dying. This is a big issue here, where there are a lot of kids. Or
I've never heard of that.
Yeah, this is huge. Yeah. And another, and just down the line, you'll have a town where 80% are 65 and over. So guess what their concerns are going to be, right? So I think it depends on where you are. In Canada, to be sure, certainly in Quebec, medical aid in dying is a giant issue. It continues to be a giant issue as we move through legalization of medical aid in dying and opening access to more and more people, right, when it comes to that. So right now, as you well know, questions around mental health and medical aid in dying, questions around advanced directives. And so, if I, for instance, have a family history of Alzheimer's disease, and the whole question becomes, well, what if I'm diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease right now and I am apt, so I'm competent, I can make decisions about my healthcare? Can I, in an advanced directive, say, listen, when I start being incapable of making decisions, I'd like to sign up for medical. I'd like to go through medical aid in dying. Now, at that point, I won't be able to say yes or no because I will have lost my capacity to decide.
Yeah.
But I'm writing it right now in an advance directive saying, I, Cory, of sound mind and body, make this decision. The question is that still valid, in years from now or months from now or whatever? Same thing with children, right? And we don't ever want to think about children with terminal diagnoses, but that is the reality. And the question comes up there as well, medical aid in dying for minors. And so those are huge issues right now in Quebec. But we're also, there are all kinds of other ones, that I can think of. I think of the intersection between the environment and human health, right? Often we don't make that connection as well. We think of them as two separate issues, the eco crisis and human health. They are deeply, deeply linked. I think this is another big, big one for bioethics right now.
Climate change, that kind of thing.
All of that, right? I remember,
Carbon,
I mean, a great colleague of mine when I was in the US in Atlanta, was a Baptist preacher. He was great, the Reverend Durley. He would talk about Gerald Durley, and he would talk about how if you don't see climate change as a social justice issue, you've missed something, right? It's a justice issue. Yeah. And he says this, right? When you look at Atlanta, guess which populations are living against highways, against industry, in those areas, right? We're talking about often Black Americans who are living right near factories, right? Yeah. Belching out whatever chemicals you can imagine. And guess why their respiratory distress rates or the respiratory disease rates are through the roof, right? Asthma rates and so on and so forth, which are completely disproportionate for that particular demographic. It's a social justice issue, right? There's a justice issue there. And so all of that kind of mix, I think, with environment, the eco crisis, justice, and bioethics, that's another big one, right. I would say. I don't know. I think other things are, just the rapid movement of technology, right? Just across the board, especially in healthcare. That's where I work. That's the area in which I'm interested in, and just the quick movement of technology across the board, right? In medicine and in healthcare, and people keep asking these things, even like with stuff like ChatGPT, which has rocked the academy, and about, well, do we need professors? Do we need pastors if ChatGPT can write your homily? There was I talked about this at the panel that there was a rabbi who wrote a piece not very long ago. I'm happy to send it your way. Where he says for the Shabbat reflection, he used ChatGPT to write the reflection just to see how it would go, and so he plugged in. It's on I can't remember what the subject was, but it was on mercy, let's say, and he asked ChatGPT to write his reflections for the Shabbat service. And sure enough, like his congregation applauded him and like standing ovation. He's like, never before have I had that. And now my ChatGPT.
They didn't know. Okay.
Yeah, that's right. And they didn't know. And now he's like, gosh, now what? What does this mean? And same thing in healthcare. People are saying, what about AI in healthcare? And these just giant issues where I think we who are trained in theological bioethics have so much to say, because I think we bring the justice light to it all. Like I think of, I remember when I was in Rome for our meeting on AI ethics, and one of the representatives from Rwanda was talking about how they've adopted a certain app that people with cell phones can use. Now, if you don't have a cell phone, you're out, right? That's an access issue. But there's a certain app where you can plug in your symptoms, because finding a physician or getting to the village physician is so difficult, or the city physician is so difficult, that people use these apps now. So they pull up the app, they put in their symptoms and say, this is how I'm feeling, so on and so forth. And the app says 40% chance you have disease A, right? Or whatever it is. Now, this is all debatable, right? About what that all means and what does this mean for healthcare and so on and so forth. But at least it's like a first encounter, if I may, right? Or first access to these kinds of things. But the Minister for Health from Rwanda was saying, interesting, because this app was created by by the Western world, European world, who did not have malaria on their radar.
Right.
So, somebody who has malaria symptoms, plugging them into the app in Rwanda, which is very, very possible, plugging them into the app, and it doesn't say, it says the flu or something else, right? It gives you some other kind of diagnoses, and the person's like, okay, I can deal with that. Because the people who made them did not have that particular experience in mind, right? And so that's where technology and justice and issues around culture and cultural literacy and so on and so forth become really important. So I think these are all big ones in bioethics. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and to go back to ChatGPT because it's a huge topic nowadays, especially
Yeah.
because it got invented or it was released in November 2022.
Yeah,
That's only a couple months ago.
Yeah.
You know, it's interesting that the rabbi used that for their speech or whatever the equivalent of a homily they have in Judaism. I've been to a synagogue like once in my life. It's a synagogue. It was to visit a rabbi.
Oh.
But yet, like, I'm actually surprised that ChatGPT would tailor something religious because when I tried to get answers from ChatGPT to do my comparative analysis, because my thesis is a comparative study of eschatology, comparing Catholic and evangelical views on the end times, the Book of Revelation, Apocalypse, and all that jargon.
Yeah.
ChatGPT would start off by saying, "I am not religious in any form, way, shape, or form." But blah blah blah. Here's your theoretical material. Go ahead, run with it. So I'm actually surprised that the rabbi actually used something that would most often start with "I am not a religious source" or whatever, but here's the information. So yeah, it's interesting to see how these devices like I don't know if you consider ChatGPT a software or an open source. It's an artificial intelligence agent. That's for sure.
Yeah.
But I think, like, I'm a believer that, limitations have to be put.
Sure.
Because if AI gets out of control, shit's going to happen.
Then what? Yeah. Right. And I think that's where we are. In many ways, I think, and this is again where when we talk about the resources of theology, and it's not just exclusively theology, but in religious studies, but I think very often when I'm in these circles and people are discussing these, ethical issues in AI and you name it, very often it's the theologically trained that will say, well, wait a minute, here, hold on, there are giant justice issues here, huge access issues here. One that came up was the bias that is kind of programmed into, consciously or not, into AI, right? Racial bias, you name it, that's programmed into face recognition software, face recognition technologies, and so on and so forth, that needs to be, not only need to be corrected, that need to be named, right? That's something that I think theological bioethicists have had on their radar for some time now. ChatGPT is interesting because I just had or was it, I can't remember if it was ChatGPT, I think it was, that I had a colleague of mine who is Hindu, who said, Cory, what I did the other day, I just wanted to try something. And I think it was with ChatGPT. And he said, I put, I wrote I went onto the engine and so on and so forth. And I wrote, tell me a joke about Krishna, right? Who's an important figure in the Hindu tradition.
Right.
And it said, can you tell me a joke? And so the AI thing, I think it was ChatGPT, gives him a joke about Krishna. And he says, okay, now tell me a joke about Jesus.
Okay.
And the program responded, I'm sorry, I'm not programmed to do that because it's considered offensive to some. And he said, okay, tell me a joke about the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
And it said the same thing. I am programmed not to be offensive, and so I can't tell jokes about that. But he's like, but it had no problem with Krishna, right? And so he's like, so clearly something's being fed into the programming of this technology that is completely problematic, morally problematic. Yeah. So who is it, right? Who's behind it? And we do know that, I think we forget that, right? That there are human programmers behind these technologies, which are supposed to be made in order to facilitate, right, human living, not to do that kind of thing. And so that, I think theological bioethicists have largely been on top of, let's point this out, right? Can we talk about this? Right.
Absolutely.
So that's been fun. Yeah, that's been important.
Yeah, I mean, to draw an analogy, I competed in the 3MT a couple of weeks ago.
Oh, no way.
Yeah, you're probably aware of the 3-minute thesis.
Yeah, I was a judge not long ago at Laval.
Oh, really? Interesting. Yeah. So unfortunately, I did not win, but it was good to participate.
Yeah.
I'm super competitive by nature, so I really like winning, but I was kind of bummed out. And the girl that won actually was doing her MA in software engineering.
Fine.
And to draw an analogy with what ChatGPT is able to decipher, distinguish, and detect, let me draw an analogy with soap dispensers, because she was working on soap dispensers, and she was asking herself whether or not soap dispensers were racist, right? Because apparently, and like it blew my mind when she first presented this in practice, if someone who's white, passes their hand under the electronic detector, like they would, the soap dispenser would, would squirt out some soap for a white person's hand. But if someone who was darker tone, like a black person or a brown person, would pass their hand, oftentimes they would have to go several times to have that thing react, or even not have soap at all.
Because the sensor can't.
Right, yeah, because the sensor can't detect a black person's hand. So I think her hypothesis was that, folks that developed the software that goes into the electronic detector was programmed for white people's hands, because apparently white engineers were inventing it, and not black. At first I was super skeptical, because I was thinking, okay, well, first of all, soap dispensers have been around for a while. Not a super long while, but a while. And why are we talking about this now, like in 2023? I think soap dispensers have been around since, I'm going to say whatever later, perhaps the 2010s. Right? So, and she won the competition, which is great for her. She also won People's Choice Award. So, like, apparently soap dispensers have an ethical problem now, and they're just supposed to dispense some goddamn soap.
That's interesting. Right? Yeah. So, I mean, but it just goes to show you that is a good example, a mundane example, or ordinary example, where you're like, that is a bias, that the person who is creating it did not think outside of their own particular experience, their own particular identity. And so the technology in question was made to serve a very particular and very specific clientele. I don't know, do I say clientele? But I think that's right. That
probably inadvertently.
I mean, whether it was conscious or not, is another thing. And whether it was intentional or not is another thing. But it just goes to show you how systemic, how these things are built in, right? How these phenomena are built in, and that I think has been a very rich conversation in bioethics too, about even these what looks like a mundane kind of thing reminds us, right, that wait a minute, this is ubiquitous, right? This is everywhere, and it's like inherent. So how can we weed it? How can we identify it first of all, and then counter it? And I think that AI is bringing that to the fore, even though I don't think that was the point. But now we're seeing all these biases, and we're thinking, listen, the biases that you've been keeping and harboring are now being programmed into some of these systems, and I think we need to call it out.
And all these loopholes that are going undetected, flying under the radar. It's something that may be concerning when it comes to talking about AI and ChatGPT.
It's certainly one of the major issues.
Right. And now, is AI heavily related with bioethics? Like, I'm pretty sure, like, you can probably elaborate on.
Whether we want to or not, I feel like this is like one of the subfields that a lot of us are turning toward. And interestingly enough, I think the theologically trained persons are all over it. There's you can look up AI and faith, which is a new consortium of people of faith who are in computer engineering, computer science, engineering, you name it, on the ground, people who are working with tech, high tech, AI, and so on and so forth, who are trying to grapple with some of these major ethical questions from a faith perspective. And so there's a wonderful, it's a wonderful consortium of specialists from around the globe, really, in many ways. And so I think this conversation is being had up front. I think it's going to be a very important part of bioethics, especially because AI is being integrated into healthcare, right? So that automatically kind of makes it now I don't want to say our problem, to be sure, but another issue, right, to add to our list, because it's what we do as specialists who are exploring the biomedical sciences and healthcare writ large, and that's now a big part of it. Yeah, that's a big part of it.
And it's interesting to see how, like, something that can be such a useful tool is at the same time quite an imposing challenge.
Yeah, and that's exactly the point, right? And this has always been, I think, in many ways one of our deep concerns about technology, right? That it goes out into the world, and the question is, well, did you think about what the moral implications or what the ethics are about this kind of thing, or did you just get it out there because you can do the science, right, to get this technology out, for instance, and so you did, and now your name is attached to it as having been the innovator and so on and so forth, and that's all good and wonderful, but did you think about what it's going to do on the ground? And very often the response is, well, it's a neutral technology and it just depends on who uses it. Perhaps, yes, perhaps, but it really does, these are really important conversations that are being had and need to be had. And AI is definitely in that framework, right? About, yes, it's going to be really, of course it can be really useful. It can also be pretty destructive. And so how do we manage all of this? Is it possible to manage it all? Is it beyond us, at this point? But I mean, especially in healthcare, there's a lot of talk about how when physicians lament, for instance, the fact that they only get, a certain amount of seconds with a patient in a day because there's just a lineup of people waiting for them.
Right.
Well, maybe AI and AI types of technologies can help collect all of the family history and all the information that we need and so on and so forth, that you don't need the physician to do that, but that, whatever that AI technology is, can do that work so that when the patient is actually with the physician, they can speak to each other, not over a screen while the physician or the healthcare provider is putting all the information in as if you don't exist because they're not even looking at you, but have it more, they can have more time with the actual human patient. So that, you can understand, you're like, oh yeah, that makes sense. I can see that being a very helpful tool. And then you have others who say, well, wait a minute. There's a fine line though between AI being of help to human practitioners, right? Human healthcare providers, and replacing them, right? And I think that's where people want to stop the buck, if I may, right? Making sure that we're not being replaced, but being aided or being assisted.
Right. If I were to just swerve around here, what would be your standpoint regarding this whole matter?
I think like every other technology, we just need to be attentive and careful. And I know that sounds very, very cliche, very generic, but I'm not a person who necessarily will scream out, hey, it's going to be a no to technology. I'm a no. I remember once teaching when I announced that I was going to be giving a course in Catholic bioethics. I remember a colleague turning to me saying, "Oh, Cory, I bet your textbook is going to be really, really short." And I'm like, "What?" He's like, "It's going to be like a pamphlet that just says no," because everyone knows that Catholics are anti. And I'm like, wait, before you even finish that sentence.
It's a presupposition.
Yeah, all these presuppositions about religion and religion being anti-progress and so
religious people's standpoints, because we might disagree on a lot.
And I get it, but this caricature of people of religion being Luddites, or being anti-technology, is so problematic, and you just have to read the history of religion and science to see that that's not the case, and that was actually an early addition to the conversation. But that being said, I think our role again as theological bioethicists is to keep this all in check and to have these conversations about the ethics of whatever the new technology is, to make sure that they're actually happening, so that it's not to say that the technology goes rampant, but we want to make sure that these conversations are being had seriously and constructively, and that people in policy are attentive to them, right? So that we don't lose track of where things are going and what things are meant to do, right? That if the technology is meant to serve humankind or to serve, to help us with the environment, for instance, and then you put it into action and it's actually doing the exact opposite, it's replacing humankind or it's destroying the environment, there's actually only little written about environmental implications of AI, which are actually quite vast. But only now are people coming up with this information. And I have a friend who's writing on it who is surprise, a theologian, right, who's talking about all of this. And I think that needs to happen. I think people need to be aware, and I think theologians and specialists in religion are where people are going to be looking.
And I think more and more literature is going to be written in the next decade about perhaps the dangers of AI, if I can put it that way, and maybe the pros and cons of using AI in healthcare, and how to tie AI, properly tie AI with bioethics and proper bioethical procedure.
I think the question is always around progress, right? And there's this caricature again of people of faith, of religion writ large, as being anti-progress, right? There's that whole notion, which is not how it goes, right? Now, granted, are there voices that are saying, put the brakes on this until we understand it better? Yes, and I think for good. That's a good thing in many ways. In my own tradition, we define progress as, or we look for something as progress if it contributes to human solidarity.
Right.
So in my own religious tradition, that's what it says, that progress is not progress unless it contributes to human solidarity, to binding the human community. If it does otherwise, it's not considered progress, even though you might say, yeah, but look at the advancement in the science or whatever that might be. My own tradition will say, yeah, no. If it's not somehow, contributing to human flourishing or whatever that might mean, or the human-nature relationship and so on and so forth, the common good, then that's not progress. And I think that's where these conversations become rich and important,
Absolutely, for sure. And, so we covered a lot of ground, honestly.
My goodness.
And it's been a pleasure just to talk about these different things. And now, if I bring it back to TITC,
sure,
and the topic, because it really captivated. Like I think your talk, Dr. Jameson's talk, and there was another talk. I think it was a guy from Laval, I think it was Sebastian.
Oh yeah, sure.
Doan.
Yes,
Sebastian Doan.
biblical scholar. Yeah,
those were
wonderful.
the 3 talks that really grasped my attention, and I really felt compelled to write about those, especially for the hermeneutics class that we had, because we had an assignment that required us to attend.
Wonderful. That's awesome.
And being one of the organizers at the event, it was something that was super interesting. I just received an email a couple of days ago from Dr. Ojema. I'm probably butchering his name. Anyway, one of the speakers at TITC last year, in view of TITC 2024.
Fine.
So I'm wondering if you're going to be talking at that event, or if you have anything planned.
Yeah, we just received some notes, right, about that planning is about to be underway. I think there's a meeting actually coming up in a few days about looking into that, and I very much said I'm willing to come and chat about what we might want to make the focus of that particular event in 2024. So yeah, I'm already kind of all over it, right?
Is you Laval hosting it? Right?
No. I know that McGill is involved,
right,
in organizing. I know that this Department of Theological Studies, will continue to be involved. It's been this department's baby, if I may, right? And so whoever is carrying the baby in the next round will always have that's right. It's not being tossed around.
The hot potato.
That's right. But I think that's always been the understanding, is that the Department of Theological Studies will continue to have a very important hand in organizing and in hosting this event, and I'm glad to hear that it's that McGill is also bound up with the event. To be sure, I think more and more, especially in the area of theology and religious studies, do we need to find ourselves as partners and less as competitors in a world that's still grappling, right? Especially the academic world, still grappling with the relevance of theology in this particular century, right? And I think the more we partner, the more we can synergize, right? The more that we can bind up our strengths and show the world that there is still a deep wisdom that is pertinent, right, to these kinds of conversations.
I think synergy is a very important attitude to have, or an important approach, because when I recall, grading people, I noticed how many people were coming from a sociology or political science or psychology or philosophy background, and I've always considered theology, and I've come to learn more and more that it is such a central topic. And that it stretches into these different areas like the psychology, philosophy, and especially like by rebooting Authorship Street podcast. Like my ambition is to invite folks from different departments. Like I know at 3 p.m. we're going to have Dr. Eric Rossetti. He's from political science. I was on the phone this morning with a neuroscientist, a psychologist, discussing like how we can talk about science, even though it's within the confines of a theology department. And I was trying to find convincing arguments to link sciences, especially with my science background, and see how him as a neuroscientist / psychologist, how he can talk about drugs and that kind of thing.
Oh yeah, and you'll want to talk to him about neurotheology, which is a whole new field.
Right? Oh, really?
Well, new. It's actually been quite a while.
First time I hear about that.
Yeah. I mean, and this is what's so great about the field, is that, especially when I think about at Laval, when we have our courses in like our introduction to theology courses and so on and so forth, I'm often invited to give some of the opening remarks there, and I talk about bioethics and theology. I'm like, let me show you, or let me talk to you about how theology is incredibly relevant for thinking about bioethical issues. And the students are like passing out, not literally, but are like, this is very helpful, because I have no idea why I'm studying theology, in fact, and I'm not even sure that it's relevant. Nobody's really convinced me of that yet, but I know that it's important. That's why I'm in the classroom right now.
Or
I just don't have the words,
or
or whatever it might be. Yeah, that's right. But I think this is where it's really fun, when when we look at neurotheology and people are like, I'm sorry, what? Theology is talking about is engaging the neurosciences, and you're like, yeah, what's the problem? Right? Like, if there's a natural, for me, it's always been a very, of course it is. What's the issue? Or especially in medicine, or when I'm speaking with people in healthcare, and we'll be talking about the meaning of suffering and so on and so forth, and I'll be like, well, religion and theology has lots to say about that. And they're like, oh, does it? I'm like, that's been our province forever. Like, we've been talking about suffering, talking about theodicy, and trying to grapple with all of these wrestling with all of these giant issues for centuries, of course. And so I think people need to be reminded that there's a repertoire, right? That there's a huge resource there that's untapped, that is untapped. And I think people have to understand that you need not be a theist in order to appreciate the importance of these resources, right? That you can really,
I mean, Bart Ehrman is probably an atheist, and he has contributed a lot. He's a huge name in the world of theology. And now that you're mentioning something called neurotheology, I'm definitely going to look it up because it's the first time I hear about.
Yeah.
Like I've heard about neuropsychology
Sure.
or neuroscience, but like neurotheology. Like
Yeah.
how do you link the study of neurology with theology? How do you match those? And maybe 10 years down the line, it's going to be a specialty field for someone to write their MA thesis on.
It certainly is, yeah.
But yeah, I'm definitely going to look into that. And overall, like I'm pretty excited for TITC 2024. I sent an email that I'll be at the meeting as well, so we might
we'll see each other there
again. Hopefully, I'll be the MC for that one, or
we'll
someone
see.
else.
That's right.
Well, I'll be greeting some specialists and all that. So, yeah, I was wondering, like, any thoughts, like final thoughts, like just regarding the whole academic journey, and you know what? Before we actually dive into final thoughts, please. I noticed that you teach at Laval, and earlier, right before you got here, I just remembered I called your number at the Laval office. Yeah. I was wondering, linguistically now, like, is it? I know your last name is Labrecque, so I'll be French Canadian, right? Is it a challenge to juggle with both languages? Like I'm from Toronto, I had to learn French at 7 years old.
Yeah, that's right.
So how do you manage both?
Yeah, thankfully I was again blessed to be in a world where both languages lived in harmony, right? Even though the province didn't always see it that way, to be sure. I come from a family. It's interesting. My dad, even with a name like André Noël Labrecque, which is as French Canadian as Quebec as you can get, was born in Nottingham, England.
And how did that happen? Like,
well, that's another podcast. Yeah. But it's a well-known story for Anglo-Quebecers, right, who have roots in the United Kingdom forever. In the United Kingdom, with one grandparent, it's often a grandparent, and then another grandparent who's from here, right? So that's exactly my story. So my French Canadian grandfather was in England during the war and met my British grandmother who was serving as a nurse and so on and so forth, and they hop, skip, and a jump. They got married and had my father there in England, and then were on the Queen Mary, right, and sailed for Canada. And my grandfather brought his new bride, I guess, and you can always ask questions about whether or not she wanted to leave England or not.
Arranged marriage or
how does that all work? That's a whole other thing that I wish I had more time to talk to my grandmother about, but she a blessed memory now. But and then so they came to Canada, and names were, when they came to Quebec, franchised, right? So my grandmother, Anne Mary Mills, became Annie Marie Labrecque, and she was an Anglican, became a Catholic, of course, when they were married. That not surprising either. And my dad André became Andrew Knoll, right? Andrew Knoll, became André. So they, that whole kind of history there is a very rich and interesting one. So I was born into a family that was British and French Canadian, and so had both languages at my door, right? So that's kind of what I grew up with, and went to English schools, but with lots of French immersion, and happily grew up very bilingually, and took that for granted until I went to the U.S. and realized that bilingualism was not like just a normal thing, right? Where a lot of my colleagues are like, oh yeah, that's not that common in this part of the U.S. And I'm like, oh, I just took for granted that everyone knew all kinds of languages, right? Because I've always been surrounded by that in this part of Canada, where people are polyglot, like we say, right? Many language speakers, and so I've been very much at home at the University of Laval teaching in French, even though my mother tongue.
Like listening to the answering machine, you have a pretty good spoken French.
Yeah, thanks. I've been here
and you Laval
forever.
French school. Right?
Yeah. Which is great too, because I come now with having been taught at McGill in English, having spent a number of years in the United States, especially in Atlanta, which is a culture of its own, and then coming back to Quebec, speaking and teaching in the French academic milieu has given me lots of stuff to work with, and it's been a great journey indeed.
Wonderful.
Yeah,
that's great. So I was just wondering, like, because a lot of the folks that are going to be watching the show, hopefully my viewership just skyrockets, which is a very ambitious dream. We were talking about ambition earlier.
Sure.
A lot of people are going to be academics, or folks that are probably undergrads or graduates even, or PhD students, or mostly students. Any final thoughts for students, or even for professionals, grown adults that want to know more about theology, go back to school or anything? Like,
Yeah.
What's on your mind right now as we wrap up the podcast?
I think what I love about teaching in theology is that here is where not only is the cohort I teach in theology, because I teach in theology, religious studies, medicine across the board, but my students who are coming into theology, very often there's a deep, again, interdisciplinarity there. These are students who are often, like you and I, have been trained in the sciences or in some other field and have come to theology looking for a certain lacuna or a certain kind of I don't want to say a void, it's not appropriate, but looking for a different kind of conversation, right? Or a different kind of way of thinking, a different vision, a different approach to some of these giant questions, right? That are not necessarily being addressed in the fields in which we were originally trained. And so what I love about, theology is that here you have usually an interdisciplinary cohort of people who are coming to the study of theology and religious studies in many ways because they know that the people who are coming there too often also have a different kind of training, so they bring a different voice. That's number one. What I love also is that not all of my students, to be sure, but a good number of my students are also second careers.
Mm-hmm.
They're coming into a second career, or they've had a great career and they're coming now thinking, now is the time for me to be asking these big questions and to be thinking about these existential questions from a faith perspective that I can analyze on my own now. I'm ready, I'm comfortable with this. I have the experiences of my life behind me or under me or with me, whatever that might be. And so that makes for a very rich discussion, I think, in theology and religious studies. I'm binding them to now writ large because my faculty is both. And so I think this is just to me such a fascinating way to explore, the big questions, not just around human meaning, but suffering, mortality.
Right.
Is there value in the fact that we are limited as human beings? What is our goal in the sciences? This whole idea about dignity and empathy and all that stuff that should be common lingo, in the world around us, but is not. Now is the time for us to pause and to engage these questions from this field that is a bridge, right? That is a perfect bridge between so many others. It allows for conversations to happen that are not being had in other, in other domains. And so I say, welcome, to this study, and for students who are in it thinking, oh my God, I made a mistake. What am I doing in theology, or what am I doing in religious studies when I should be doing one of the stems and so on and so forth, which are really, really important too.
Yeah.
Well, welcome, right, to an integrating field, an integrative field, an engaging and engaged field that will really help you make connections, right, while you're exploring these, incredibly relevant, incredibly important, pressing, and timely, especially ethical issues. I'll speak for my own domain in this century, in this time. And so I think that's important for theology students and professors, of course, who are already in the field or people who are looking to it. I think they'll be they will only find a rich conversation here.
Absolutely. I wouldn't even call them rich. I would call them sacred.
Yeah, in many ways, I agree with that, right? This is and I especially look about, I think about the language of holiness, right, which is in many ways to be set apart, right? And this is how I think about theology and religious studies. I look at it as a space that has been set apart, right, that has been carved out in order for these delicate questions to be looked at, again, in a robust, constructive, academic, intellectual way that I think people are craving for, right? They want that, not only because they want that kinds of, those kinds of discussions, but I think we need to have them in order to fuel what it is we're thinking about our own personal experiences, right? That what we're seeing on the ground at home and what we're seeing in our own personal lives. That's what I love about, the study of theology and religious studies, is that after I study it all, I go home to my family and think about the relevance of what I've just studied. Living, right? Right with it, living, right? It's all living. Yeah.
And then I'm guessing you feel like it's your turn to share the knowledge and partake in the conversation with your kids
and I see this with my kids all the time. My kids are wonderful theologians, right? They see things. They have a certain wisdom, right? That in theology we talk about wisdom as sight, and they have a certain way of seeing things that I have lost in many ways. And so when I talk to them, without the PowerPoints, but when I talk to them about some stuff, if I may, at their level, they are the first to open my eyes to things that I have not been able to see.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool. Because yeah, when I think about it from my perspective, like I'm 28 years old now, and I started the program when I was 26, so I'm taking my last class now. But like,
Right.
just like when I look at my CV and the fact that I have to, and I'm not bragging or anything, but
Sure,
sometimes I
sure,
have to write in, Arial 8 because of the fact I'm trying to squeeze
Too much.
everything in. Having done scouts and playing high school football, flag football, coaching a bit of soccer with my dad, and but most importantly academically, because I'm a huge learning junkie.
Yeah,
like,
that's great.
I love learning. I have masterclass, I have Udemy courses. I'm a Six Sigma yellow belt.
That's great.
Kind of. So
Yeah.
I really enjoy learning, and my journey was kind of weird but special the same way, because I did biochemistry as an undergrad, graduated in 2017, 2018 ish, and then I got fired 3 times in the span of 5 months, because either I was too green, or the lady that was supposed to train me had her baby at 7 months instead of 9,
Oh,
so
gosh.
she had to drop me there.
Yeah.
I couldn't fend for myself, so they had to cut me loose. But then when I picked up a sales job, I learned salesmanship.
Sure.
And it was night and day, because I worked at Molson Coors in sales, and having won 4 sales competitions within the span of a year, and then I quit because I wanted to study for an MBA.
Right.
I knew I wanted to do a master's. I didn't know what exactly,
Sure.
but I knew that I wanted an MBA. Right. So, and failing to get accepted into an MBA program, butchering my GMAT,
Sure.
right, which cost me $400
Yeah,
on top of the hundreds that I
Yeah.
spent investing into it, and then applying to the MA in theological studies just off a whim, like thinking, wait, okay, so I look at their admissions criteria, and they're not specifying what bachelor's degree you need to have. They just have a few bullet points. If you have that, you can apply. My McGill grades were good, because I was
Sure.
yeah, while I was at Molson, I was working full time, but I was studying part time at McGill. So I picked up 2 certificates, management and marketing, on my way to an MBA. But then, okay, well, I have a 3.0 out of 4, which is a good GPA, but I really want to get into a master's program. So I was like, okay, well, I know that I just finished reading the New Testament. I know that I like theology.
Yeah.
Why don't I give this thing a try?
Sure.
Right. But then again, I was thinking, okay, they're going to be thinking, this guy has a couple of business degrees.
Yeah. What is he doing?
With an undergrad, bachelor's in biochem. What the hell is he doing? But then, I'm eternally grateful to Dr. Lou Chandrachesky, who opened the door, because he's the graduate program director here. He's like, we had an interview, super cordial, amazing time. Like we spoke for about 45 minutes over Zoom. It was during the pandemic. And he said, yeah, you're in. I was like, what?
Well, oh no.
Humanities,
oh, wait a minute. I didn't even think about
I'm this Cartesian, square-headed, business / science guy, and you're taking me into the humanities. And when I got in here, there are folks. There's a guy who used to be an engineer, Mark Sharshore, who just successfully defended his thesis. We have folks that Alicia. She's an exercise scientist. She works at the Performance Center. I'm from the sciences. You have folks from English Lit.
Sure.
Very few are the folks that are from theology. Right, that actually leap into the MA.
Oh yeah. And as I said before, it's a bridge.
Yeah.
It's a bridge, and I think this is one of the fields where the training that you had in other domains, it ends up becoming incredibly useful.
Yeah.
And if you're like, well, that content is not at all. Yeah, the content is going to be vastly different. But the skills that you picked up in those other domains are going to be interesting to the way we think theologically, right? And I think. And it's not just going to help you as a person who's studying theology, but you're going to bring a certain richness, right, to the discussion that other, that may not have been there, right? So I think that's really important. There's a different kind of contribution that people bring, and it's an important one. When I was at McGill too, I remember, some of my closest colleagues had a bachelor. One of my closest colleagues friends had a bachelor in physiology. The other one had one in environmental science. The other one had one in. I mean, you're right. I mean, the number of I could probably count the number of people who were trained in theology or religious studies who continued onto the masters that I knew. Now, it could be because my circle was religion science, and so it made sense that I was surrounded by that. But what I'm saying is that it was not an anomaly, right? That people came from very different backgrounds, but asking many of the same questions.
Yeah.
Right? And flocked to us.
What really sometimes pisses me off is sometimes when people ask me, if I'm studying theology to become a priest or a pastor.
Yeah.
And I'm like, okay, guys, you can't be that short-sighted. Come on.
Do you not know?
It's a university program. like not everybody in the program, the 45 or 50 people that we're not all going to become nuns and priests. That's not the point.
We're studying to become nuns and priests.
Yeah.
I mean, and good for those who go on to do that, which is not, I suspect, are few and far between, especially in Quebec. But that's constantly the understanding, right? Or the caricature, again, I've used that word a few times today, but of what we do with theology and religious studies, because that's, I think, what people wonder. What are you going to do with that? Right now, it's the same question that we ask for with a lot of degrees, but I think, again, when I talk about constructive analysis in the context of theology and religious studies, a lot of people are like, "Are you sure you're putting those two in the? Do they go together? Are you sure you can? It's not just praying and singing and." I'm like, no, it's not. Yeah. It could be. I mean, for some people, but I think that's what I deeply appreciate about theology and religious studies is again, and forgive me for being a broken record, but it's this deep constructive analysis around questions that mean everything to me as a human being in a human community, in the world, in a broken world, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so, everything that I've seen in my life, my grandmother who ailed, or the dying of my mom, and being not having a dad when I grew up, or an illness and disease, and not just that, but limitation, and then we can flip the coin, joys and accomplishments, and so on and so forth. All these big questions that we have around that. And I think about the importance of theological resources for thinking about those giant questions, because theologians have been thinking about them for centuries.
Yeah, and that's why I really label the conversations that we have in the theology classroom as sacred, because, and not to be judgmental or anything, but like when we step outside the classroom and we go to our respective lives, the Mr. Joe on the street that doesn't know anything about theology is not the type of person that we can have that type of conversation with, and the dialogue and then the sharing, the intellectual stimulus that happens within a theology classroom is absolutely sacred, because of the fact that it deals with it's in simple terms, it's God talk.
Yeah, it is, and I think that's why.
Higher power,
and I think there's something about the Mr. Joe, right? That what I love about theology, and it's what I love about bioethics as well, is that the person on the street, if I may, or that the person outside of the ivory tower that we always talk about, has everything to add to the conversation, because when you talk about God or questions of faith and the existential questions that I ask in theology and the big ethical questions that I ask in bioethics, you better believe that every single person, regardless of education, regardless of where they're coming from, has something to say, and often there's wisdom there to say about these big issues. Mm-hmm. There's no way that if you're on an airplane, taking a long flight 10-hour flight to Rome, the number of times where people will say, "Oh, what are you reading, or what are you studying?" And I'm like, "Oh, I do theology, bioethics." That's the end of my flight. Now it's a conversation about God, or about religion, or about medical aid in dying, and it carries the entire flight for 10 hours, because this person might not have finished high school or has a PhD in chemistry or whatever. It doesn't matter. Everyone has something to say. Atheist, theist, Christian, Hindu, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. Everyone has something to say about the whole God thing, if I may, the whole suffering thing, faith, religion and science, medicine. Everyone has something to say about this stuff. And so when we climb out of the ivory tower, very often there are people waving their hands out of the down there, and that's it's a terrible hierarchical metaphor, because what ends up happening is that we leave the building, we leave the tower, and there are all kinds of people saying, "Yoo-hoo, I'd like to chat. I want to chat. Tell me about what you're learning, so I can hear about it and tell you about my experiences," and so on and so forth. So it leads to dialogue, and it could be sometimes very conflictual, and there could be lots of tension there. Very often it comes from, it can come from dark places. Sometimes it's quite the opposite, but I think everyone has something to say, and I think that's where the ivory tower model no longer really works well for theology, and certainly for bioethics, because I have patients who are waiting for these conversations, and we have people who are asking questions about God because they've seen things that they can't, and so the tower needs to be dismantled. And we're coming in. We're in Holy Week right now in the Christian tradition, and there's this beautiful reading about the veil of when Jesus is crucified, the curtain is torn. We are told the temple curtain is torn from top to bottom. This understanding in many ways that suddenly access to God was no longer secluded, or was not it was not exclusive to a certain order of humans. Right now, it's made accessible to all, and I think of that the ivory tower has been torn down in that way. Like the veil has been torn apart because people are wanting, if not yearning for these kinds of conversations.
Right. I think they are, definitely, and I think given that we happen to operate within that ivory tower, once we step out of it, I think it's our responsibility to have the empathy and the outreach to accept people into the conversation, and not
To
suffer
welcome.
noses to people that may not have as much knowledge, may not have the privilege to have access to that type of knowledge. I think it's definitely, and it's something that I try to challenge myself to do, like just to, even if it's the guy, picking up my broken down car with CAA, and even though he's one of the many people that have asked me, like, if I wanted to become a priest because I'm mastering in theology. I'm like, no, then we crack a nice conversation. He talks to me about his Greek Orthodox faith and whatever.
There you go. Yeah.
And I talk to him about Catholic faith, and we start talking about like God or a higher power or the afterlife, or all these different interrelated topics that happen. And even we stretch beyond the metaphysical, and we start talking about perhaps the ethical and the philosophical issues that may be related to these types of conversations. Cory, it's been a pleasure.
It's been fun.
I hate myself for having to stop right
now.
I would really like to talk more. If you ever want, you're always going to be a guest.
Pleasure.
Having seen you at McGill for Father Guy Consolmagno's talk, and at TITC, and hopefully we get to work together.
Yeah.
Hopefully
for the next TITC round. Yeah.
You seem to be a great guy. Like it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.
We're hopefully we can perhaps, like, an idea that dawned on me during our episode is that if we could invite maybe 2 or 3 more people around this table to talk about bioethics, like folks like Christine Jemison or Daniel Tessalon. I'm not sure if you know him. Had coffee with him 5 years ago, actually. He probably doesn't remember who I am. Daniel Tessalon, or folks that are specialized in bioethics. I think having a podcast episode with a bunch of bioethicists would be a wonderful thing for the future. Just throwing it out there. So guys, thank you so much for listening. I'm Chris Dagger. This is the wonderful Dr. Cory Labrecque here. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this podcast episode. I think it was a very insightful one, where we really delved into sometimes difficult topics. Bioethics is not an easy thing to do. Being a theologian and a bioethicist, I think, is a very demanding profession. I think it's something that requires a lot of courage, and I commend you for that. So stay tuned for Dr. Eric Buzetti. We're going to be talking about politics, political science, perhaps what's going on in America, or however you want to call it. We're going to be talking about that, and Greek philosophy as well, and how that correlates with the whole political landscape. On that note, guys, thank you very much, and stay tuned for the next one. Deuces.
So great, Chris. That's fun. You must get all kinds of fun conversations. You really have to be on the ball.